So thank you very much for inviting me to come along today to speak to you. And I will also do my best to try and explain what's on the slides, because I didn't think, being up in the Lake District, it was the sun I had to worry about. But there you go, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Before I kind of go into the presentation and the things I wanted to talk to you about today, I wanted to start with a bit of a story. And the story is of somebody we worked with, but it's a story that's very close to my heart because it's very similar to something that happened to one of my grandparents. And an organisation we worked with got a phone call from a distressed daughter of one of the service users that they worked with. And she said, I'm really worried, my dad is having respiratory problems, and the on-call doctor at the care home has said that he's not going to put him on a respirator. And this has happened in the past, and he's been okay once he's been put on the respirator. But the on-call doctor says maybe it's just his time to go, and I don't know what to do. And so the advocacy group we worked with, they said, right, well, firstly, two things. Mention, has the doctor thought about your father's right to life and the doctor's obligation to make sure that he's respecting and protecting that right to life, and get a second opinion. She didn't need to get a second opinion. She mentioned human rights, and all of a sudden her dad was put on a respirator, and her dad was fine and is with us still. And who knows what might have happened if she just hadn't had that tiny little bit of knowledge to mention human rights. And for me, the reason that that's such a powerful story is because one of my grandparents actually passed away because they were given an oxygen tank that was empty and no one was there to complain and to raise the arguments. And just knowing that tiny little bit about human rights is what can make the difference between life and death in some situations, but what can also really just make the difference for making sure that people are treated with a bit of dignity and a bit of respect. We sound very grand, the British Institute of Human Rights, sound like a big organisation and kind of academic institution doing lots of maybe research type work. We're not. We're a very small independent human rights charity. And what we do is we help people to know about human rights. So we do outreach work, we do lots of information and resources. We help people apply human rights. So we do an awful lot of work in the health and social care sector and in other areas as well. But kind of for the last 10 years or so, we've done a lot of work with both service providers and also advocates and patients groups as well. And kind of thinking about actually what do human rights mean in practice. It's this piece of law, but what does that actually mean in reality? And then we also help people to protect human rights, to use that evidence of what human rights are in practice to inform some of our more national policy and legal debates. Okay, so a tiny little bit of history just to kind of get ourselves centred around human rights and what's at the heart of human rights. And so lots of the things actually that we talked about kind of recognising people's dignity, recognising their equality of rights, and really in the aftermath of the Second World War, that's when all of the kind of world, the international community came together and started talking about human rights for everyone and setting them down in laws. Of course, human rights have a long history in lots of philosophies and cultures and religions and societies, but it was really after the Second World War and when we saw what a democratically elected government could do to its own people just because they decided that they weren't worthy anymore of rights. So the whole world came together and started to set down these international laws. And the first thing that happened at the United Nations, which is kind of the forum where all the world governments come together, is the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the first part of that opens with all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. And that's really the heart of what human rights are all about. They're about us as individuals and about recognising that just because we're human, we all have a level of dignity which should be respected. But they're also a lot more than values. So we hear a lot, and I think the things when we talk about in terms of human rights that we're more familiar with are concepts like dignity or equality or fairness or choice and control, autonomy, lots of things actually that we've heard today, a lot of the similar concepts and words, and they're the things that we're probably more familiar with. But human rights are also kind of about more than values because they're set down in laws, and those laws can provide us with a really practical framework for looking at some of the issues that we're facing. So these are kind of some of the things that some of the people I work with talk about. So Kath, who is a mental health service user actually in the Northwest, and I was just kind of up visiting the unit that she's at 2 weeks ago, and she talks about human rights being about rights to humane, dignified treatment and things I should have access to just because I'm a human being. And then the legal advisor in an NHS authority, she talks about them as a set of recognisable principles on which authorities can base their everyday work. And then the committee in Parliament, which deals with human rights issues, it talks about human rights being a legal framework for service providers to abide by. So it's kind of the rules for how we do our business. But it's also about empowering service users to be able to demand that they're treated with a level of dignity and respect. And I'll go through kind of how each of these work in terms of our actual law under the Human Rights Act. But just a quick reminder about health and human rights and kind of health and social care and human rights. Well, the NHS and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights are both celebrating their 65th birthday this year. Yesterday was Human Rights Day, and obviously the NHS is celebrating its birthday. And it's kind of often forgotten that whilst kind of the UK was out internationally setting up these international laws around human rights, at home what we were doing was setting up the NHS and that idea of kind of free access to healthcare for all people. And we see kind of actually human rights interwoven into a whole set of things that are incredibly important to health and social care on a day-to-day basis. It's in the first article of the NHS Constitution. We see it woven throughout the Care and Quality Commission through their guidance, their inspection, the commitments that they're making publicly now. We see it through a range of different Department of Health policies, particularly ones around kind of treating service users and patients with dignity and respect. And we've all heard lots about the numerous different inquiries that have happened into various different failures of quality of care. Often what they're talking about are human rights issues. So, kind of from that very kind of broad international perspective, what does this actually mean here at home and in practice? So when I talk about human rights being a framework, what do I really mean? Well, what I mean is the Human Rights Act. And the Human Rights Act, I'm sure lots of people have heard all about. We can have a discussion about whether what we've all heard is necessarily quite the truth. But what the Human Rights Act does is two very simple things. Is firstly, it makes rights that are in the European Convention on Human Rights part of our law. So what kind of Churchill and lots of leaders after the Second World War did was create the European Convention on Human Rights. British lawyers were kind of very involved in drafting it, and we set up this convention and this court, and it had these 16 or so rights set out in it. And that's great, but the only way we could access them was if we went off to a court in France, in Strasbourg. That's not very practical. My colleague actually went there in September, takes 17 hours round trip on the Eurostar, and in 1950 there wasn't a Eurostar.
That would have been from London.
It would, yeah, and that was from London, exactly. I know that would have been another 8 hours from here. So not exactly the most practical thing. I've been talking about human rights being practical. That's not very practical. So what the Human Rights Act did was to bring those rights into our law and make them accessible here at home. And I'll talk a little bit about how it does that and what that means. But the other aim of the Human Rights Act was to help develop a culture of respect for human rights. And that committee in Parliament that I talked about, what they say that means is that where we all kind of take on and internalise the kind of ideas of human rights, where human rights become the way that public services develop and deliver policies and services, and that individuals know what their rights are and are able to access them. And so how does the Human Rights Act help us to do this? Well, it works in several ways. The first way is that everyone can ask a UK court to look at their issue, and I think that that's probably most of our concept of human rights. It's about people going to court and kind of asking courts to look at their issue. And now we can do that. We don't have to go to Strasbourg. But the idea of developing a culture of respect for human rights is really actually about these other parts of the Human Rights Act. And the first kind of one of that is the legal duty on all public authorities. So in Section 6 of the Human Rights Act, there's this duty on all public authorities to act compatibly with the human rights in everything that they do. And what that means is any kind of public official, so anyone who is performing a public function, any public official has that responsibility. So it's not just this idea of the government or the state as a far away kind of idea of, you know, kind of politicians sitting in Westminster or making kind of big decisions at kind of central government level, yes, they're covered, but it's also about everyday people that we bump into. It's about lots of people in this room. It's about people who work in social services, who work in NHS organisations, who work in our state schools. It's all of those officials have this duty to make sure that they're acting compatibly with people's human rights. And the other thing that the Human Rights Act does is that all other laws should be compatible with rights in the Human Rights Act. So it's almost like the lens through which you look at kind of other laws that might be part and parcel of what you're working on. So, for example, kind of thinking about safeguarding policies. Well, the reason we safeguard, kind of, if you go back to No Secrets, the reason we safeguard is to protect people's most basic human rights. It's right there in the first few lines. Often we've lost that link and forget that that's actually where it comes from. The Mental Capacity Act, we have that because there were lots of challenges to existing mental health law, which were kind of challenging the fact that there were many provisions which were not respecting people's rights. The Mental Health Act has been significantly challenged over a number of years and changed because of human rights cases that have been brought against it. So using the Human Rights Act, but the human rights in it as our lens through which to look at all of these other things that we're doing is a good way to make sure that we are meeting that duty to be acting compatibly to respect people's human rights. So in that way, human rights can help provide a vital safety net. Sorry, no videos, but there will be some pictures. What are the duties? What do they actually look like? Well, we talk about them as being three types of duties. So there's respect, protect and fulfill. So respect is to not to do something to somebody. So don't take away somebody's life, for example. The protect is actually to take action, and it's a positive obligation to step in and take action to protect somebody from harm. And that could be to protect somebody from harm from another private individual. So, for example, in terms of, say, child abuse or domestic violence, it's not going to be the state official necessarily. It's not going to be the public authority kind of worker who is doing that behaviour to that person. But if they know about it, then there's an obligation to step in and protect them. And also to fulfil as well. So to kind of make sure that there are ways and means for people to access their rights and to be able to enjoy them and to realise them. That's about processes, about procedures, it's about having all of those things in place. How do human rights work? Well, not all human rights are absolute, first of all. I think there's often a perception that all you have to do is claim that something is your human right and then that ends the conversation. And that's actually very rare. Most human rights are actually not absolute at all. The Human Rights Act says that most of the rights it contains are actually rights that can be restricted or balanced. But in order to restrict or balance them, they need to be lawful and proportionate, and that needs to be evidenced. So proportionality is really the key thing. Yes, something that you're doing might interfere with somebody's right, but you can still do that provided that it's a proportionate response to the issue. So we talk about not cracking a sledgehammer with a nut. So what does that actually look like in practice? Kind of a care home example. So two gentlemen, we'll call them Fred and Tim. They have been showing increasingly aggressive behaviour, both towards themselves and to other people. And so the staff at the care home are kind of slightly concerned that there might be an incident. And a decision is taken to install CCTV cameras across the entire care home. But then there are 22 other residents in the care home who don't necessarily pose that risk at all, who are now being filmed by CCTV cameras. So for them, there's an issue about their right to respect for privacy and private life because they're being filmed. But there is also an issue about making sure that action is being taken to protect Fred and Tim from themselves, and also to make sure that the people in the home are being protected from them. So proportionality would say, well, why don't you kind of maybe look at installing cameras just in Fred and Tim's room if you're concerned that there's going to be an issue with them? Are there issues where you can reallocate staffing? Are there issues where you can have a rota or a programme system? But what human rights would say is that idea of a blanket kind of policy that covers everybody, that's probably not going to be compliant with human rights, because that is a restriction that is not proportionate, that is going that step too far. Yes, you can take action, but let's find the most proportionate type of action. So which human rights are going to be most relevant, do we think? Can I ask, how many human rights do we think there are in the Human Rights Act? 12. 13, 15. 42. Oh, I like it. Any more takers? No? Well, it is, depending on how you look at it, between 15 and 16. Because the 16th one is the prohibition on the death penalty, and often people don't always kind of identify that as a right. Basically, that's one of the rights in it. So it's 15. It's actually quite a small kind of piece. The rights in it are actually quite small. You can fit them on 3 pieces of paper, which I think is often quite surprising that it's quite a small piece of legislation. But some of the rights that we find in our work that come up time and time again around issues to do with safeguarding, with dignity, vulnerable adults, vulnerable children, the kind of rights that come up time and time again are ones around the right to life, the right to be free from inhumane and degrading treatment, the right to liberty, the right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence, and the right to non-discrimination. These are ones that tend to come up time and time again. So what I'll do is I'll just talk you through a few examples of what they actually mean and look like in real life. So the right to life, it was mentioned earlier, this issue around kind of do not resuscitate orders. And we've been working with quite a few advocacy organisations, and one of the groups we worked with, they were visiting their client in hospital, was an older gentleman. And he'd had a do not resuscitate order put on his file, and nobody had spoken to him, nobody had spoken to his family or his advocate about this issue. And it then transpired that on the older person's ward, it was a blanket practice to put a do not resuscitate order on everyone's file, just kind of standard practice, just something that happened. And so that advocate challenged that and said, I think that might potentially raise some issues around the right to life. It's not to say that do not resuscitate orders breach the right to life, but having no consultation with somebody about treatment that might potentially save their life, that's a bit of a no-no in human rights terms. And on that ward, that policy was changed. But the reality is, with lots of the groups that we work with, we do see that kind of as something that is often repeated time and time again. There's a case kind of recently with a gentleman who had Down syndrome, and the note on his file read, has Down syndrome, not able to swallow, do not resuscitate. And that was the whole of the assessment around whether a DNR was appropriate or not. So this is kind of an issue that is kind of pending. There hasn't kind of been a definitive legal case around it yet, but there are cases that are going through the courts at the moment. The right to life in courtrooms. We've seen increasingly cases around suicide risk, particularly in mental health settings. And one example was of Melanie Rayburn, who she was a voluntary patient in a mental health unit, and she was known to be a suicide risk. She had said kind of several times that she had wanted to take her own life, and she left the unit. No action was taken to kind of potentially section her or to kind of find a way of having that conversation with her, and she took her life. And her parents actually brought an action using the Human Rights Act to say that there were powers that could have been used actually to protect Melanie in that situation, and they weren't used, and that resulted in Melanie losing her life. But it also resulted in her parents having their right to respect for their family life being interfered with because their daughter is now no longer here. So we're seeing increasingly kind of that it being used in that way. And the right to life has kind of those 3 different obligations attached to it. So you shouldn't take someone's life away from them. If you know their life is at risk, you should step in and take action to protect them. But you should also have processes and procedures in place to investigate when life has been taken, and we see that through inquests. And I'll talk a little bit later as well about the Francis inquiry into what happened in mid-staffs. The right to be free from inhumane and degrading treatment. This is one of those absolute rights, one of the very few ones. And it kind of sounds a bit technical, but it's really about kind of really severe neglect and abuse. It's those sorts of issues. That's kind of the terminology that we're probably more familiar with. For something to be inhumane and degrading treatment, it has to be very, very serious because there is no justification ever for it. If it's inhumane and degrading, it doesn't matter if you've got tight resources, it doesn't matter if someone intended it or not. Those questions don't come into it. So that's why the harm has to be very serious. But when you're thinking about how serious it is, you think about the individual person as kind of you know, their health status, their age, their gender. So, for example, my nan has just turned 90, and if she was in hospital and wasn't given food and water for 24 hours, that would have a very different impact on her than it would to me, because she has very serious health issues, and she's an older woman. Wouldn't be nice to me to be deprived of food and water for 24 hours, but it's probably not going to touch that inhumane and degrading treatment level. So what does this mean in kind of some real life situations? Very recently, and in fact also in the Northwest, a group we've been working with, someone who we'll call Balbir, but not her real name. And she, at 47, had a stroke and became very severely disabled and a wheelchair user. And she lived in a small home with her 2 teenage sons. Her bathroom and her bedroom were upstairs. She was told there was no housing allocation, no kind of adapted housing that would be available for her to use. So she should have a bed in her living room and have a commode in her living room and strip wash in her kitchen, whilst that's the areas that her 2 teenage sons use as well. And this went on for about a year. And then the advocate that had been working on one of our projects around kind of how you use human rights language in your day-to-day negotiations, they kind of mentioned actually this could be inhumane and degrading treatment, kind of put it in their letter, kind of had a few conversations. And it wasn't that a house was magicked up, because everybody knows resources are tight, but there was availability to turn the downstairs kind of cupboard under her stairs into a toilet. That meant that she could at least use a toilet in some privacy and have some level of dignity. In the courtrooms, it's been used around failures to act to protect people. So, for example, in child abuse cases, one kind of quite famous one where kind of this obligation to step in and take action was really kind of drilled home. And it was kind of around 4 siblings who, for 5 years, were left in a situation where there were numerous interventions by various different people, the police, different social services, education authorities, all sorts of people. But the children weren't removed. And in fact, in the 5-year period when they were removed, it was only because the mother had asked for them to be removed. And that did go to court, and that was one that went all the way to European Court of Human Rights. And they said, whilst there is obviously a difficult position and then there is a balance that has to be taken, for it to have gone on for 5 years, that meant it was inhumane and degrading treatment. At an earlier stage, there could have been things that could have been done to prevent it from getting to that point. And so the right to respectful private and family life, which is the next one I'll just touch on, sounds like the longest kind of title in the world, and it sounds like it's CCTV cameras and all of those things, and it is those things, but it is things that we also mentioned about enjoying your family life with your family members. This is the one that seems to be the most important in terms of recurrence. It comes up all the time in the work that we do. So private life isn't just about CCTV cameras. It's about having this little bubble around yourself, but it's also stepping out of that bubble. So in terms of the bubble around yourself, it's about making sure that you have physical and mental well-being and integrity. It's about having a say over what happens to you, about what happens to your body. But it's also about stepping out of that, forming relationships with people, kind of being a social person, having kind of family and sexual relationships with people. And it is also about some of those issues around confidential information and having a degree of control over that information. And family life is about kind of maintaining kind of, in inverted commas, normal family relationships and ongoing contact if families are split up. And that's been particularly important around couples that might be split up and being sent to different care homes, for example, and kind of using the language of human rights to say, well, actually, they have a right to respect for their private and family life. So at the heart of this right really is dignity and autonomy. Those are kind of, and choice and participation. Those are the things that are really at the heart of this right. And this is one of those rights that can be balanced. So you can restrict this right, when it's necessary and when it's proportionate, but it has to be necessary and proportionate. And so just some examples of that. The first one is a really recent one from some work we've been doing, which is actually in this publication, which just came out this week, which is called The Difference It Makes, Putting Human Rights at the Heart of Health and Social Care. And I would highly recommend it, not just because we wrote it, but because it goes through the links between health and human rights, and it actually kind of spells out lots of real-life examples of how this stuff really works in practice. And so from this project, one of the groups we worked with, they had 3 service users who were from London but had been placed in a care home in Newport Pagnell, I think, a long way away. And because of budget cuts, they were being told that actually they had to come back into London, and that they were going to kind of be put in a different facility because that would be cheaper for the local authority. And their advocate kind of spoke with the local authority about kind of this idea of respect for private and family life, and that the people hadn't been consulted about that decision, and actually what would be the impact on them of moving them, and surely there was a way that this could be looked at and reconsidered. And so it did, the authority did stop and think again, and they kind of weighed up all of those factors, and they put that kind of the respect for people's rights into that decision-making process. And as it transpired, kind of the money that was saved was not so great, and they came to a situation where those 3 individuals could stay in the home that had become their home, become the place where they kind of lived, where they had their private and family life. And in the courtrooms, lots and lots of examples. One of the ones that comes to mind is one from about 18 months ago, which involved a young man with learning disabilities and autism. And he had gone to the swimming pool because he liked the water, and his carers had gone there with him. And he was staring at the water. And the pool centre manager thought something dodgy was going on, so he called the police. The police arrived, and the carers kind of said to the police, this is how you should talk to him. This is, he'll get very agitated, and this is the best way to approach this situation. The police kind of didn't necessarily pay attention to that and kind of wanted to just remove the individual from the situation. He then jumped into the pool. The police then jumped in after him. 5 officers ended up dragging him out of the pool while he was still wet, handcuffing his arms and his feet, and then put him in the back of a police van. This case was, for this young man, it was human rights that enabled him and his family to hold the police to account for that treatment. They were doing it maybe from the best of intentions, but was their action really proportionate to the situation? No. And that's a really important thing to remember about human rights is it's not about individuals' moral judgments, and it's that someone actually said this to me yesterday, someone who works for a local authority, and she said that the path to hell, the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions, and actually what human rights does is take it outside of your own moral framework and kind of gives you something to use to make those decisions rather than it being a battle of morals between different people. And so for that young man, human rights was the thing that helped him get a little bit of accountability and a little bit of justice, and that was kind of held to be a breach of his right to respect for private and family life. So lots of what I said has been about human rights, kind of about empowering service users. But I should also say that some of the examples also involved empowering staff members and people in local authorities to speak up and to change the situation for the individual. So their advocate might have been a statutory advocate, it might have been a social worker. And we often see that actually in our work with the public sector, is the way kind of different departments are often kind of, we've talked about kind of silos and people not talking to each other and miscommunications, and actually all of the people in that situation have human rights obligations. And so for one kind of part of that system to say, well, we're fulfilling our human rights obligations, this is now passing on to you and you're going to fail in your human rights obligations if you don't take action. So we see a lot of that in the conversations between social services and housing, and then adult and children safeguarding as well. And it can just be not a kind of an accusatory way of looking at things, but more of a let's make sure that we're not doing the wrong thing, and let's make sure that we don't end up in court. Let's make sure that we don't end up in a situation where there's going to be a serious review. And from our work, kind of, there are a few things that come out of kind of why using human rights is really important, why referring to it in our work is really important. Obviously, the first one is it's the law. You're not supposed to be breaking the law, so kind of obvious, but it's about a lot more than just compliance. It's about improving the quality of outcomes, and that's for service users and staff. A trust that we work with in Liverpool has used human rights to really kind of transform a lot of the work they do in their learning disability and mental health directorate. And it's kind of been evaluated by Ipsos Mori as kind of being more than just good practice. It's about a standard of care which really empowers staff and service users. But their own kind of evaluation as well has shown that for service users, they felt like a human rights approach improved their own mental well-being and improved their own health situation. But for staff as well, it improved the way that they had their relationships with service users, that it changed behaviours, it changed the way people looked at people, it changed practices and it changed behaviours. So there are some real kind of benefits of doing this work. Personalisation, it's all about the person. Human rights is about that individual person. It's about placing that person at the centre of your decision making and of policy and practice. It's about meaningful engagement. It's about not just doing things or just talking to people. It's actually about engaging with them properly. And that's both individuals who might be service users, their families, their carers, but also staff members. Improved decision making, we talked about that earlier. It provides a framework. It's not a battle of morals. This is the framework that we have to make our decision within. Nobody I am an optimist, but I do believe that in general, nobody goes into any kind of health and social care work because they want to abuse other people's rights. I think that in general, that's the way it is for most people. But like we said, it's not about best of intentions. It's about actually providing a framework for making that decision. Can be reduced risk of litigation, but not necessarily complaints. And so in Manchester, another group actually worked with the CQC because they did some work around informing people about their human rights, and that meant they got more complaints because more people were able to speak up. More people felt empowered. And they worked with the CQC to use that as a flag or a kind of a monitor for success, not for failure. And smarter allocation of resources. It's that idea of prevention over cure. It's that idea of, you might end up in court, that's going to cost a lot of money, but it's also about making that intervention sooner rather than later, kind of looking at the situation now before it gets to a critical situation. So this WYSI graphic is from this book. And this is how we work with groups around a human rights approach and what it really kind of getting practical and what it means. And lots of these things will be familiar, and we talk about the panel approach. So the P is for participation. That's of all people. So that's all stakeholders. That's staff, that's service users, that's family, that's carers. We talk about accountability. That's about legal duties. Who has legal duties? But it's also about accountability within who has responsibility for driving forward this work, who has responsibility for driving change, for making sure that people are treated in a way that respects their rights. Non-discrimination, so avoiding non-discrimination, and particularly looking at groups who might be kind of particularly vulnerable. Empowerment, again, of all those people who should be participating with knowledge and skills around realising human rights. The process of change is going to be so much better if all of those who are involved in it are actually involved in that change. And then the anchor that holds all of those things together. Lots of those things are things that we already do, and this isn't necessarily about something new or adding kind of to an already increasing workload. It's about bringing it all together, and the anchor to that is the law, and talking about these things in terms of actual human rights law, of the actual rights, and talking about them in terms of the Human Rights Act. Because what that gives us is, this isn't just wrong, or this isn't just cruel, this is inhumane and degrading treatment, and the law says that you have a duty not to do that. That is a much more powerful conversation than this just really isn't the right thing to do. And it's all about that change of language and helping to empower people within services, people using services, and their advocates to push forward and change that makes sure we are all treated with a bit of dignity and respect. So the group I talked about in Liverpool, we kind of work with them around risk assessment in their Learning Disability Directorate. And now kind of the philosophy is rights maximisation rather than risk assessment. Safeguarding isn't about closing down, it's about making sure people have the opportunity to enjoy their rights. So it's one of the psychologists actually that we work with, she says, think about how much it costs to keep people in Winterbourne View. I can provide an independent living service that respects people's rights for an awful lot less than the cost of an institutional setting. And so just thinking about the cost, kind of actually human rights doesn't have to cost more than any other alternative. But more importantly than that, it is about making sure that each of those individuals have that dignity and respect and that they are able to enjoy their rights to the maximum possible degree. We kind of created resources by service users, kind of for service users. We have a Freedom Fighters group, and kind of a group of service users who are empowered kind of with human rights knowledge to know what their rights are, and they decided quite quickly that the programme of work that was being designed was not appropriate, and it wasn't appropriate because it hadn't been designed with them. We then co-designed a new programme of work. We have Keeping Me Safe and Well, which is a risk assessment tool which is also available on our website, which is kind of going through with those individuals how you assess risk. It's kind of very picture-based. It has a traffic light system. It talks about what these kind of rights mean for people in their everyday lives and how you can assess that risk. And a family quality mark. I was on one of the mental health units the other day, and you know, I talked about other groups, vulnerable groups, and not kind of excluding anyone. Well, in that mental health setting, there was a realisation that children were being excluded. They were coming to visit their parents. They had that right to maintain contact. The setting was not the way, not the place for those children to be in. And so worked with the children to develop a Jelly Baby mark. And now the children themselves have their own quality assurance mark for the mental health units in which they visit their parents. And if it's sufficient for them, then the mark is awarded. And if it's not, it's back to the drawing board. And what can we do to make sure the children's rights and their parents' rights are being respected? So I am going to wrap up very quickly and just say I will talk about making the links to the law, very important. Everyone we work with says that's what can transform the conversation, whether you're a public sector worker, whether you're an individual or an advocate. This is about what matters. We've talked about mid-staffs a lot today, and I just want to leave you with Mary's case, Mary's mum's case. She was an older woman and she went into Stafford Hospital following a fall at home. She had cancer, but she wasn't expected to die at that time. She was on a ward for older people and she often wasn't given fluid or food that was left out of her reach, and her family often found her in soiled bedding and the staff wouldn't help clean her. She developed pressure sores, she became dehydrated and malnourished and contracted a whole range of different diseases that I can't even pronounce, like MRSA and E. coli and C. diff, C. diff, and a few other infections. She was an inpatient for 3 months following a fall at home, and she died. And the funeral home called the family and said that their mother's body was too full of infection to bury. It was too contagious, and she had to be buried in a body bag. And what people don't know about the mid-staff situation is that 109, I think it's 109, it may be slightly more, families, the accountability that they all got was because of the Human Rights Act. They worked with a legal firm, who I know quite well, and they said this is a breach of our family's rights to respect for our private and family life, but also to those people who have lost their lives, to people who've been treated in an inhumane and degrading way. And all of those cases were settled, all settled at a significantly higher amount than kind of damages is normally awarded in terms of courts. But we don't hear that. We don't hear that human rights was what got all of those families an individual apology. We often hear really negative, bad things about human rights, and I would caution you to always look at them with a slightly sceptical eye, because it's things like Mary and her family, that's where human rights have real meaning and can actually really change things for all of us and our lives. I just want to leave you at that point with, there's lots of resources which are available. I'll give the links out after today. But I just want to leave you with this one quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, which if anyone's ever heard me speak, I always end on this quote, because for me, this is what human rights are really all about. And Eleanor Roosevelt was, I talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights kind of at the start, and she was one of the drafters of it. And she said, where after all do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they can't be seen on any maps of the world, but they're the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice and opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless they have meaning here, they have little meaning anywhere. And that's kind of where I would like to leave you, because all of you have an amazingly important role in making sure that human rights have small places and close to home, both for ourselves, our families, our loved ones, and the people that we work with. So thank you very much.